months and years, the people of Karenni have suffered many retaliatory attacks by the junta. Almost every village we traveled to was either abandoned, partially destroyed, or in the most severe cases, completely burned down by the troops of the regime. We drove to this completely abandoned refugee camp. It used to house like 10,000 refugees, but from one day to the other, the Thai border guards just showed up and told everyone, pack your things, you're going back. And people simply do not have the protection against the mosquitoes. It's also really frustrating when you enter such an area that you see that there's no international organization present. There's no United Nations, no major organizations supporting the IDPs or the people.
Thank you for taking the time to check out the Inside Myanmar podcast. If you like what you hear, we would be very grateful if you might consider rating, reviewing, and/or sharing this podcast. Every little bit of feedback helps. Also, be sure to subscribe to the Inside Myanmar podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And if your feed is not in your podcast player, please let us know and we will ensure it can be offered there.
And welcome back. My guest today, Thomas van Linge, is another person who went on a trip that we've already had an episode about. We spoke to Michael about a trip to Karenni State, and he made mention of a Dutch journalist who accompanied him to Karenni State to document the situation, the conflict, and the nature of a junta occupation. And we're lucky enough to be joined by aforementioned Dutch journalist. So, Thomas, thank you very much for joining us, and I'd like to give you the chance to introduce yourself and your work to our audience.
Hi, thank you for having me. So my name is Thomas van Linge. I am a Dutch journalist and conflict researcher based in Amsterdam. And I follow armed conflicts, civil uprisings, protest movements around the world, including in countries like Venezuela, Sudan, Ukraine, and of course, since 2021, the Spring Revolution and armed rebellion in Myanmar.
And so, let's talk then, because we've heard one perspective on this trip in Karenni State, and I want to talk about what you saw and what you experienced. But before that, I want to sort of understand the journey, because it's Myanmar, as I'm sure we're going to discuss, doesn't get the focus in international media, particularly Western media, that it really deserves. This is not the sort of place where we really have journalists just lining up for the opportunity to come and report on the ongoing crisis. So, what was your journey as a journalist to deciding, you know what, I want to go into Myanmar? I think it's worthwhile doing this. I think I can find an audience for for what I'm going to see, what I'm going to report on, and just getting to that point when you're sitting in Thailand, ready to take that step. How did you get there?
Well, I'd say there are multiple factors. First, there is the the personal interest that I had in Myanmar. Being someone that specialized in civil uprisings, in rebellions, protest movements, just a general struggle um, for like democracy against autocracy. Myanmar was right up that alley, and I was following the protest in Myanmar from like day one, from the moment that the coup took place in February of 2021. I was really at awe with the bravery of the Burmese protesters, with their persistence, as they continued to take to the streets and to resist. And I was also fascinated by how they successfully transformed that civil street resistance into a armed rebellion. And so already, I think 2 years ago in 2022, I took it upon myself to be the first one to map out the conflict in Myanmar, to identify the different resistance territories and to distinguish where the front lines are, and to sort of, get a broader map of the situation. I've done such work before in Syria and Iraq, and I've always noticed that once you're able to map out a specific conflict, that the interest of others towards the conflict will also increase because a map makes it more palpable. Um, so that was one of the things I was already doing around Myanmar, and being a journalist working in media. Of course, I also worked uh, around other conflicts these past few years, but I've noticed that especially as of the past 6 months, that there are other wars going on. There's the conflict in Ukraine, there's the war in Gaza, and because those two wars get back-to-back coverage, they sort of take up all the space, they sort of smother any. And because those conflicts get back-to-back coverage, and they take up so much space, so much airtime, so much space in the newspapers, they sort of push out any other conflicts that take place in the world, like Sudan or like Myanmar, a bit like a cuckoo bird, that sort of pushes everything else out of the nest. And of course, as a conflict journalist, I'm very happy that Ukraine and Gaza get all the coverage that they deserve. But it's disheartening to see that it now comes at the expense of what's happening in Myanmar. And because of that, that made me feel even more uh, called for, or like made me feel even more um, inspired to then actually do focus on a conflict like Myanmar and try to, get that back into um, into the papers, get it back under the attention of the people. Because it's a very popular term in Western media to talk about forgotten wars, forgotten conflicts, which I always found a very frustrating term, especially when when it's just people on the streets saying like, "Oh, Sudan or Myanmar, it's a bit of a forgotten conflict. I'd forgotten it was taking place." That's understandable, but when the BBC or CNN or the New York Times refer to Myanmar as a forgotten conflict, I've always found that very frustrating, because it's their responsibility as a global publication to make sure that it's not a forgotten conflict, and to then already sort of address it as it is a forgotten conflict. That sort of takes away the responsibility from them to give it consistent coverage.
I think you've opened up a lot of very interesting points here. The first one I want to touch on is what you said about mapping the conflict. And I agree with you that maps are incredibly, incredibly important. Being able to visualize a conflict, being able to paint territory in different colors, it's not just important for explaining the severity of a situation to an audience, but I think it's also very important from the perspective of showing change over time. And of course, at the time of recording, we are very close to the Special Advisory Council from Myanmar releasing an updated um, uh, what is it, effective control map,
Mhm.
following on from their 2022 release. So that's hoping to do exactly what you're talking about. But what makes it tricky is that whenever we speak to, for example, the Special Advisory Council of Myanmar, whenever we speak to people who are using satellite imagery or who are using local media reports or who are aggregating information in a variety of different ways to try and map out the territory, they always tell us how difficult it is, because this is not like a conventional war such as we understood them in, World War One, World War Two, where you have a clearly demarcated front line and this is their territory, this is our territory, and this is how far their artillery can reach, and that's that. This is much, much, much more complex. Were you finding any? Did you find that you had to compromise in trying to map out the conflict, or you had to just limit the scope of what you were trying to map out, or did you just find a way to be able to draw a line that could meaningfully differentiate military controlled territory from liberated territory?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it was a huge challenge to map out Myanmar because in a lot of regions in the country, be it Sagaing, Makwe, Karen, there was not very clear distinguished front lines, like as World War One style, but there were a lot of gray areas, sort of areas where both parties could operate, where both could move through. Um, but sort of still in the style of my map, it's distinguishing different territories with different colors. So how do you map that out? I decided that for my own mapping, it would be I would distinguish different territories based on permanent presence in a way. That would mean like if there would be, to take an example, a couple villages near Moniwa in the Sagaing region, where PDF groups were active, and there was like no uh, permanent junta presence, like no military base, no pro junta militia, no police station. Um, then I would mark it as a PDF territory, even if junta columns could still sort of move through the territory to attack resistance forces to burn their villages, as long as they would leave afterwards. And I think that like the fluidity and the freedom of movement for all sides in the Myanmar conflicts was really a distinguishing feature of Myanmar compared to other conflicts like Sudan, Syria, and what have you. And that does require then a bit of a different methodology in how to distinguish different territories in that way. But definitely, when I first tried to set up my Myanmar map, in February of 2022. I think I published it around like the first anniversary of the coup. I had to really start from scratch, and build a map from just a blank shape. And that was definitely one of the most challenging conflicts I had mapped out so far.
I mean, I can imagine. And focusing on Karenni, which is where you went up going, as you were mapping out Karenni, what was your overall picture of Karenni like? Did you have Karenni as partially military controlled, partially liberated? Did you see it as fully military controlled, fully liberated? What was it looking like? Because historically, as it was called at the time, chaos state was
Mhm.
was under heavy military control, more so than most of the rest of the country, in fact.
Mhm.
So I'm just wondering, at the time that you were looking at it post coup, how did you assess it in your map making process?
Um, I think Karenni was definitely was one of the states that early on I had marked a lot of the countryside as already being with the resistance,
Mm,
because in Karenni, it was the first state where armed clashes broke out again. I think, if I remember correctly, it was in May or June of 2021 already, fighting in Loika in Demoso. The KNDF was founded, the first PDF groups were mobilizing there. So it was very clear. It was very clear early on that Karenni was a stronghold of the armed rebellion, of armed activities. So especially in the dense jungle areas, or it already mapped those out as being resistance-dominated territories, aside from the occasional junta outpost. Um, but yeah, it was definitely hard to distinguish the exact front line in the area. And it's funny. Uh, Fast forward 3 years later, and I'm actually going to Karenni,
Mm.
having mapped out the situation, which I thought was much more detailed. And it turned out I'd actually overestimated how much territory and how much freedom of movement the junta still had.
Wow.
Looking at the map and with the information available, I thought, the junta forces still control Pruso, they control Baulake, they control Pasang, the major township centers in Karenni. So I thought they will naturally also control the main road cutting through the state, going from Loika down to Pasang, because they control all those major towns. Um,
Mm.
when I actually came to Karenni, it turned out that was not the case, and that in each of those towns, the junta forces were basically surrounded, isolated, and cut off from each other, with the different Karenni and PDF resistance groups having freedom of movement around the towns, in Pasang actually controlling the vast majority of the town. Um, so in that sense, I had even though beforehand I was uh, thinking or worrying that I might have overestimated the resistance control of Karenni and freedom of movement. When I came there, it turned out I'd actually underestimated it.
That's incredible. And I wonder if that applies to the rest of the country as well, although it would be very difficult to verify this without actually going there and observing it yourself. But I'm very glad to hear that that the military have even less freedom than you had anticipated. So then that would still imply though that you're sitting there in Thailand preparing to travel into territory which you believe still has a reasonable amount of freedom of movement for the military. So can you walk us through what's going on uh, in your head? This seems to be a different for each individual. As the date's
Mm-hmm.
coming closer, you're preparing to cross into a conflict zone. What is it like for you? Are you getting nervous or are you getting hyper focused? What's your process here?
Funny thing is, nervous. I wasn't nervous at all going in. Um, Neither about like the crossing itself, that we could be caught or something. Neither about being inside of Karenni, of Myanmar. Um, I think it was because I was fully trusting the judgment of the people I was traveling with. Um, you know, Michael, who you've talked to before, our other travel companions. I don't know in how much detail he went about who we traveled with. Um, and just the the PDF members who you were traveling with on the road. Of course, like you're in a war zone. Anything can and does happen at any time. But at least I felt, um, when when we will be traveling around with PDF, they will, consider themselves responsible for us and our well-being. They will handle that in a very secure, responsible manner. So we won't be taking unnecessary risk. And when making such a trip, that's the best thing, actually the only thing you can hope for, that you will conduct the trip in the most responsible way possible. And anything else that happens, be it air raids, shootings, whatever, it's out of our control, and it can happen. In my experience, it hasn't happened so far. Um, so yeah, I was just generally feeling good about our plan, about the
Mm.
people we were traveling with, and that's really sort of the solid foundation which you need in order to take to set up such a trip.
Okay, I mean that's probably the best condition that you can be in preparing for something like this. But then, if I remember correctly, things took a strange turn, and you weren't able to cross. I believe it was airstrikes along the border that prevented your initial plans.
Yeah, it's like when I say anything can and does happen, that then turns out to be the truth. Like, imagine we were planning to travel up to the border from Thailand and cross into Karenni state on a Friday.
Mm.
We drove all the way up to Mae Sariang, a town in the north of Thailand, close to the border, where we were waiting for to get in contact with the PDF guys so they could give us the next instructions on where to go next. Um, but we didn't hear anything. It was like around noon, so we just decided we'll wait. An hour later, still nothing. 2 hours later, still nothing. And the day progressed. It was getting late. We were starting to lose the sunlight. And then we finally heard from them at the end of the day. And they were explaining like how there were some airstrikes in the border area. And they told us it's too dangerous to come right now. The situation is very precarious. We don't know if they will come back to strike again. It's best that you guys wait. Okay, the small hiccup on the road, but um, we sort of reserved enough dates for these hiccups to arise and for us to be able to take our time and let it pass. So we just ended up the remainder of the weekend, from Friday until Sunday, just sort of hanging around northern Thailand and just waiting until we were finally able to cross. We went up to Chiang Mai, spent a couple days there, went back to Mae Sariang. Um, and on Monday morning, we finally got the green light. We finally got to go ahead to cross. Um, so we met up with our driver, the guy who would take us across the border. Um, we got into his jeep. He drove us through the mountains and through the valley. And after a very bumpy road of like driving for 4 hours, we crossed the border, and we suddenly found ourselves in Messe, in southern Karenni state. Right, so we thought we made it, we're in, everything's good. But then the next problem started to arise that our contacts weren't there, the guys from the PDF units which we were supposed to meet with. We were supposed to meet up with the guys from the Naypyidaw PDF, and they would take us all the way up to the front in Loika and the Moso, so up in the north of Karenni State at the regional capital. But they weren't there, and we didn't hear from them. Um, so we just sort of were standing around the mess and not really sure what to do. We went to a local internet cafe, and after some time, we finally got in touch with them. And as it turned out, they were waiting for us, but there had been a miscommunication because they were waiting for us at a totally different border checkpoint. And that border checkpoint was not like the next one over. It was really far away. It was like a
Mm.
day's travel, 2 days travel away. So it would really take them 1 or 2 days to even get from there to us. And having already lost a whole weekend waiting to cross into Myanmar at all, our time was very limited. So for us to wait for them to pick us up, to travel all the way with them to Loika, spend some time there, and then to travel all the way back, that was too much for the limited time that we have, like around 4 or 5 days remaining before we had to go back into Thailand. Um, so it was not feasible anymore, and we were suddenly there, like, okay, well, our current plan just sort of fell through because of the time issues. What now? And we were sort of staying at this house where a PDF member was staying with his wife and child. And he heard about our situation, our predicament, and then sort of he that night called in all his comrades, like his squad leader and all the guys from his unit. Uh, they were all from a different PDF unit, the Baulake PDF. Baulake is one of the towns in Karenni. It's more in the center of the state. And no, we explained the situation, and these guys they were very understanding. They were like, "Well, you guys came all this way here to Karenni to see what the war's like. We don't want you to leave empty-handed. So why don't we just take you along to our section of the front, to our camps and our region, and you can just speak to our guys and cover the conflict from where we're staying." And there was a small miracle that suddenly this alternative plan arose, and it turned out to be actually a very good trip. Of course, I don't know how the trip with the Nepal PDF would have gone, but I could even say with some confidence that this might have been a more interesting turnout of events, because being a journalist and looking at all of this from a media perspective, I would say that when looking at all the different states of Myanmar, Sagaing, Kachin, Shan, Karenni, Karenni has definitely relatively received the most coverage from Western international media. It's also the reason why we went there. It's still relatively easy to get there from Thailand compared to a Sagaing or a Rakhine region, which is next to impossible to reach. So it's still the place where most international journalists, Western journalists, go to if they want to cover Myanmar, if they want to write a report about the country. But you do see that like almost all the press when they enter Karenni go to the places where we're supposed to go to initially, to the Moso and to Loiko. Um, in the end, we ended up going to the southern part of Karenni, to Baulake and to Pasang, two different parts of the front line, where almost no Western press has made it, because there's simply smaller towns. Western media preferably wants to cover the biggest city around. And we could notice that how little Western coverage there was of these places. Because sometimes when we would arrive at like a PDF camp or meet some of the resistance fighters, um, they would end up, wanting to take more pictures with us than we would be ending up taking pictures of them. It's like a small anecdote. So you could really sense that they were not used to having Western journalists around their part of the front line.
And it's very strange that you say that. We recently conducted an interview with Helene, who's working with the German national broadcaster, and the story that she related of going to Karen and and covering the conflict there was very much that she and her colleagues were asked not to leave the vehicle, to avoid leaving the PDF camp, because the sight of foreigners, very obvious, Europeans, would attract too much attention. Word would get back. The military would know. It would cause problems for a lot of people. So it's very interesting that you're saying that in Karenni, the level of confidence is so high that not only are you able to walk around civilian sort of settlements, apparently uncovered with your faces out, but also that people are happy and willing to take photographs with you. It's a really stark contrast. And I want to ask, like, what? It seems that they were very happy to see you, but I am curious. Did you, I don't know, did you perceive that there is any frustration on the part of the locals towards foreigners, or any suspicion towards foreigners? Did you encounter any hesitation from the locals, or was it all just very positive and very happy to see you?
No, it was like I would say generally positive and happy to see us. And I think if we would compare, um, than the situation in Karen and Karenni, the picture that you just described. I think the difference can be explained by multiple factors. I would say, first of all, um, Karenni, it's a very tight knit community. The Karenni, they all know each other. It's all small towns, small villages, farming communities. So there's a very excuse me, a very like tight knit community where everyone knows each other. On top of that, there's also no, at least from what I saw or didn't see, there's no major displacement flows or refugee flows into Karenni from other parts of the country, which I know is a very different story in Karen. Where in the KNLA, the KNU territories, there's also been an influx of people from, Mandalay, Naypyidaw, Yangon, sort of the center of the country, and I think having these uh, IDPs enter a ethnic minority area, then that can also cause some distrust between people because suddenly there's all these strangers in your midst, and you don't know if they all are who they say they are, or if some of them are possible regime informants, regime spies, loyalists, what have you. Um, so in Karenni, everyone really knows everyone, so there's little reason to be distrusting of each other. And I think also, aside from what we also see there, is that there is a different dynamic among all the different armed groups in every region. Myanmar is such a huge country, and every region, especially since the armed rebellion, has become a bit of a world on its own. And it's a bit like a spectrum. On the one hand, you really have the regions where there's one group um, keeping a tight lid on things, where there's one group really dominating and managing the region like a one party state, like Rakhine, with the Arakan army, or Kokang with the MNDAA. Um, in the middle, you have like the regions where there is one dominant ethnic armed organization, and probably has been since the 1940s. And there are also resistance groups, PDF groups, but in a sort of a hierarchical reality, are in a submissive position below the ethnic armed organization. And I think in Karen that's very obvious with the KNU, the armed from the KNLA, and then below them in the hierarchical structure there are sort of the Karen banner PDF groups like Cobra Column, Black Panther Column, Albino Column, and these are groups which are they operate in the region. They are even to an extent armed and supported by the KNLA, but they can't go against the KNU authority. And I think Karenni was really on the other end of the spectrum in the sense that there is no dominant armed group in the region. Like the most prominent, the most well known, of course, KNDF, but they are not the ones calling the shots because really no one is, and that really created a whole mix of different resistance groups. Karenni banner resistance groups, uh, PDF banner resistance groups, EAOs like Karenni Army, KNPLF, and such. Um, but it's all a very horizontally structured resistance there. There's no one giving orders to the other. All the groups work independently but in unison. And I think that has really been a distinguishing feature of how the resistance is being done in Karenni. It's a very grassroots based and organized struggle. And in that sense, it also then gives groups like, the Baulaka PDF, then the liberty to say, hey, if we want to take these journalists to our section of the front line, there's no one in a sort of a higher up position that can prevent them from doing so because like they don't answer to anyone except to the NUG itself.
Mm. It's interesting, and it does mirror what Michael was saying about the cooperation. He was telling us about the checkpoints being simultaneously manned by 4 or 5 different resistance groups, and everyone cooperating and collaborating, and there wasn't this sort of um, posturing and power struggle within Karenni. And so you seem to be confirming that your impression is very much that they've managed to have a system, not strictly hierarchical, either, but a system of sort of, how would you describe it? The sort of co-equal cooperation. What would it be like?
Yeah, I would say, exactly that example that you mentioned. The border crossing where we went to as we entered Karenni was manned by four guys from four different resistance units. That's something I'd never even heard about in any of the conflicts I'd ever studied before. That was really a unique feature. And I think that really shows how in Karenni the different groups are not interested in carving out territories, in dividing up spoils, in playing politics even. There are there's now no major political movements sort of trying to ride the waves of revolution, and there's also like no revolutionary, like major revolutionary leaders that all people could rally behind. There's no Karenni Che Guevara, so to say. I think it's really a societal or like a collective communal struggle in Karenni,
Mhm.
where everyone does their part, everyone contributes, everyone tries fights or tries to support the fighters in every way, um, and it's a very egalitarian based resistance in that sense, and you do really feel that the Karenni are also not really interested in doing politics or phil- uh, being philosophical about how they want to run their own things afterwards. They really just want to get rid of the regime. They want to go home in most cases because
Mhm.
almost all the guys from Bolaka PDF, the guys we hung out with, were from Baulake, but were sort of in exile because their homes were occupied by the regime. So they also just want to go home and rebuild their lives. And they say, if NUG orders us to, we will march on to Naypyidaw, because we do answer to the NUG, and we do consider ourselves, part of the national struggle for liberation of Myanmar. Not we don't consider us as a Karenni liberation movement, but a Burmese, like a general Myanmarese resistance movement. Um, and I think that really distinguishes them from other regions of the country, where sort of those regional politics and just thoughts of autonomy or territorial ambitions do come more into play.
Mhm. That's interesting. I just want to clarify. Are you saying that mentality applies to the EAOs as well, or just to the PDF that are operating in Karenni?
In this case, I could only speak for the PDF units that we
Okay,
spoke to.
okay, interesting. That is very interesting, though. So I want to focus then on the civilian element of it. If you were fortunate enough to be able to go out and see civilians, see what life is like in Karenni, and I think this is one of those things that kind of gets lost a little bit in conflict reporting, because of course we want to see changing battle lines, we want to see combat, we want to see soldiers and guns and things like this, because they're interesting and they're exciting and we can understand them. And then the day-to-day difficulties of civilians who struggle with food, struggle with shelter, struggle with medicine, this sort of falls a little bit behind when it comes to reportage. But I'm very curious to understand what is the physical situation of the civilians, right? What difficulties are they dealing with? How are they coping? But also, what is, in your opinion, if you can speak to it, the morale of the civilians and their outlook?
I I think first of all the situation for the civilians is very hard. Over the past months and years, the people of Karenni have suffered many retaliatory attacks by the junta, Um, Almost every village we traveled to was either abandoned, uh, partially destroyed, or in the most severe cases, completely burned down by the troops of the regime. And many people were left no option but to stay in, makeshift huts in IDP camps somewhere in Karenni state. Because also since the resistance took Messe in June of last year and sort of secured the better part of the east bank of the Salween River, um, the few refugees, a couple thousands that were staying in camps just across the border in Thailand, had been pushed back. The Thai authorities are not letting anyone through.
Mm.
Um, when we drove actually to Karenni, the last stretch of the road before the border, we drove to this completely abandoned refugee camp. It used to house like 10,000 refugees, but from one day to the other, the Thai border guards just showed up and told everyone, pack your things, you're going back. So people are really stuck in Karenni with no opportunity to flee to Thailand, and they can just in Karenni hope for the best and build their camps under sort of a coverage of leaves so that the junta warplanes and drones won't spot them. And they really have very little. When we visited an IDP camp, they offered us food, but all they could offer us was like a rice soup, because they didn't really have much more than rice to serve to guests. Um, and now that the rain season will start, the situation will become even more difficult because almost basically all the huts that we saw are not waterproof. So rain will flood in. The camp themselves will turn into these big mudslides, where you will have to walk through the mud to get anywhere. And the most concerning thing, the thing that has concerned me the most, is the prospect of malaria. You know, with the monsoon rains come the mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes bring malaria, and people simply do not have the protection against the mosquitoes. It's also really frustrating when you enter such an area that you see that there's no international organization present. There's no United Nations, no major organizations supporting the IDPs or the people. Because as I was told later by a former UN staffer, um, the UN, they have their office in Yangon, and they want to keep their office in Yangon, which means that they're at the mercy of the junta. So they only really go to the areas where the regime allows them to go to, which is never like the areas where they're needed the most.
Mm.
So in Karenni, it really feels like the people um, are sort of can only rely on themselves and on the generous donations that their family abroad or other sympathizers or people from the Burmese diaspora abroad can bring them in terms of like donations and stuff. But despite all these hardships, all these difficulties, I've never sensed like any despair or a sort of deep morale among the people. Maybe that's just sort of the face they put on when they talk to a foreigner. I don't know, but to me, it did really feel like they're all keeping their spirits up. They all believe that how difficult the situation is. It's only temporary, and that Karenni, at least a starter, could be liberated soon, and that they will be able to return to their homes. Especially around the areas of Pasang and Baolake, where we visited, most of the villages have been abandoned because they are within the artillery range of the regime. But the regime itself is now isolated in their hilltop camps and could be, you know, uh, could be eliminated from those bases in the foreseeable future. So when those areas are completely cleared, then the people could leave their IDP camps and come back to their villages to start rebuilding.
So I just want to circle back to something that you mentioned there. The NGOs, I think this is a very interesting point, a very important point. We know, of course, that because we've had this issue for years, where NGOs or even foreign governments want to send aid, and the military says, "Okay, you can send the aid, but the aid has to come through these ports. It has to be processed. It has to be cataloged. It has to be distributed and managed by these entities that are, of course, junta controlled." And naturally, we know that the goods are going to be sold for cash, and the cash is then going to be used to buy weapons and ammunition for the military to continue creating these problems. But so you're saying that the workers themselves, workers of NGOs who want to come into the country, not products, not goods, not boxes of aid, but even individuals themselves, are still operating under the military's control, only operating in the spaces that the military allows them to operate in. Because maybe I'm very naive. It was just my impression that it was actually the other way. That like the journalists, like yourself, NGOs would be sneaking across the border, bringing what supplies they could and operating in liberated areas. But so you're saying that that's not a thing that is occurring, correct?
Well, like the small NGOs, of course, they can, and really the NGOs that have been set up by philanthropists, by religious organizations like church alliance organizations, or um, just initiatives that have been set up by people like, for example, Free Burma Rangers. They are completely independent to operate as they please. So of course they can sneak into resistance territory and help out there, and they do. Their help is really vital. I was really talking about the major organizations, like
Mm.
the UN, Oxfam Novib, um, like these global organizations that have a presence in multiple countries, including in Myanmar. And for in the instance of the UN, I was told that by a former UN staffer that they have their offices in Yangon, so they are sort of forced to operate at the whims of the regime. And then you, of course, the next logical thought that you have is, well, why are they even in Yangon if they can't do anything from there? But I was told that's actually motivated by funding. Like if they have an office in Yangon, then they can add Myanmar on their list of countries where they're active. They can show that list to Western governments, international institutions, and with that list they can then get more funding because there are more countries on that list. So by by having an office in Yangon and not doing anything there, just staying in their air conditioned office building, they can't help the people of Myanmar, but they can get more funding from governments for which they think that they can be helping more people globally at the end of the day. Um,
Mm.
of course, to us that makes very little sense, but in their mind, like the funding takes priority over actually the helping of people in that specific country.
Mm. And it's good to understand. It's good to see this distinction, because I think we often have this habit of not looking at the smaller NGOs as much. We think of these heavy hitters, the big groups like the Red Cross, the United Nations, One Vision, so on. But it seems then from what you're saying that small NGOs actually have the power to help people much more significantly and meaningfully because
Yeah,
they are
definitely.
small.
I would say
Wow.
like the small NGOs are really the unsung heroes in Myanmar. They're the only ones really helping the people and really getting there where no one else is, and really sort of still being the representatives of the outside world and showing the Burmese people that they've not been forgotten and that there's still people on the outside doing their best to help them.
Mm, that's brilliant. It's really good to hear that there are people who are doing the work and who are able to do the work. But turning then back a little bit just to the civilian situation, as you were talking about, I find it fascinating that, and I know you recognize that it might just be a face that they put on to be brave, or that maybe they're very conscious of the fact that what you as a foreigner and as a journalist see is going to be what the international community sees. But I mean, I presume, you would have seen a variety of different people, like old and young and children, men and women, and everything in every type of condition. And it is really fascinating to me that we have this situation where you say that the life is so difficult. I mean, you're even saying that these poor people have, even those who have managed to flee into Thailand to try to escape, bombing, are then being turned back by the Thai and have to cross into effectively a war zone and have to try and survive after their homes have been destroyed. And yet you're saying that they remain determined. And I don't know whether you said they were optimistic, but you seem to be saying that they're not pessimistic. And it's just it. I don't know. I think it speaks volumes. Turning back to World War II, which I think both of us have a stronger cultural connection to. Um, it's one of those cases where among the civilian population deep down where the moral right is, because even when times were tough in the countries that were trying to resist the German expansion, the German conquest, the civilians were still consistently willing to risk it all to fight against this, to work in the resistance groups, to try to sneak information out of the country, to try to support soldiers with what little food that they had. I think it speaks volumes for the, if I can use the word, righteousness of the conflict, when the civilian population is enduring such hardship and their morale is still high. They're not calling for people to lay down their arms and sue for peace. They're not calling for compromise. They're not calling for just let it end any which way. I don't care. Bring the military back, and as long as I can rebuild my house, I'm happy. You seem to be saying there's absolutely no question of that among the civilian
Definitely, and that's why
commitment.
that's why I can really think that I can say that the groups in Karenni are not political, even though they're fighting an armed conflict, because it's not a political conflict. It's really a popular rebellion against the Myanmar regime, and you can really sense that in Karenni, it's really uh, the effort is really carried by all the people, by the fighters, by the villagers, by the refugees, by the community leaders like priests and monks. Everyone seems to be on board and doing their part to expel the junta forces, and it's almost as if you are. It maybe reminds a little bit of Ukraine, where also
Mm.
the entirety of society is contributing to expel the Russian invasion force. And it almost gives the junta forces a bit of a sense of being this alien outside force who does not belong at all in the region, has no roots, no place there. And that's why almost everyone that I spoke to is still optimistic about the odds of resistance and still fully supportive of their efforts to expel the regime. And like the IDPs, um, the way I sensed it, they're not necessarily waiting for peace. They're just waiting for victory, and they would already go back to their homes if the war is still ongoing. But at least their region is free, and they can just rebuild their lives there.
I think it's such an important element of conflict that the military minded often don't think about, or they don't remember how important it is, that you cannot easily take over a territory when the population is going to reject you. They're not magically going to lay down and just accept the military, even if the military rolls in and recaptures all of the main cities. Um, and I think this is endemic thinking on the part of the military generals among the junta, that that's all they have to do. If they win a series of battles and they take over a series of towns, then deep down I suspect they think that victory will somehow magically happen. And they're not counting, and they've never really respected the power of civilian resistance and civilian rejection, of the regime. And I think this time it's coming to a head.
Yeah, definitely. I've always been amazed by the inability of the regime to learn anything.
Mm,
We're now 3 years into this, into the armed rebellion, into the conflict, and the regime is still using the same um, failing tactics, failing strategies that have led to all these resistance victories in the first place. Gather a
mm,
lot of troops and hunker them down in the hilltop camp. Tell them to stick it out for as long as possible without giving them substantial support. And then these camps get taken one after the other, um, thinking that you can really reverse the course of battle by the bombing all the surrounding villages and just retaliating against civilians, or that you can maintain your grip on power by sending your columns around the countryside and burning one town after the next, as if that is really what pacifies the country. And in that sense, it's also obvious, how the 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 regime has not been a student of history. I
mm,
mean, if there's is one, if there's like a very distinguishing feature about the recent history of Southeast Asia, it's that in almost any instance, the resistance groups, the rebellion, won in the end, whether it be in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Laos, a sitting regime which is highly unpopular and dependent on conventional war tactics, with deployment of troops, heavy armory, warplanes, but that does not enjoy the support of the people, especially in the countries in the peripheries, and does not have um, the know-how that resistance fighters have, and they ends up losing out. And I think also that's a bit of a miscalculation, not just on the regime, but also just on the international community, where excuse me, where when the conflict in Myanmar really turned to an armed rebellion, that most uh, diplomats in, be it the West or India or China or whatever, they probably saw it happening, but they figured it's probably going to go down the same way as all the other um, popular uprisings of the past
mm,
decades. It's probably going to go down the same way as in Syria, as in Belarus, as in Sudan, as in Venezuela. There will be an uptick in resistance activities. There will be unrest. There will even be war. But at the end of the day, the regime will stick it out and will win, because that's what all the other regimes have done
mm,
as well. And there was a very big underestimation of the capabilities and the persistence of the Burmese people to sustain this resistance, and also of the region, Southeast Asia itself, where geographical, societal, communal, and military factors also heavily favor a resistance movement over a conventional military force.
mm. And I wanted to circle around to this, and I'm glad that you've brought the conversation here, because you do have that familiarity, that experience with other conflicts elsewhere. And one of the things that keeps coming up as we do this podcast and we talk to more and more analysts and experts and historians and just different people with differing perspectives, is just how fundamentally different the spring revolution has been when contrasted with the revolutions that we've seen through I mean, a lot of different places. You've listed, Belarus, looking at a lot of places throughout the broader Middle East, as part, and also, outside of the Arab Spring, looking at various uprisings throughout Africa. A lot of these uprisings, as you say, they either sort of rise up. There's almost, it feels like an expression of the rage of the public, this manifestation of the anger and frustration, but then that peters out. People are hungry, they have to go home, they have to go back to their jobs. You can't, keep striking if you don't have any food to feed your family. Parents don't want to see their children get arrested and don't want to see them get shot. And of course, the government comes out with the police or the military, and they start using more and more suppressive tactics. And eventually, resistance dies down, and pressure builds and pressure builds and pressure builds, and it explodes again. I think Iran is a good example of a country that has gone through a cycle of this, where the stress builds, it explodes into protest movements, and then it quelled slowly, and the pressure builds again. Or alternatively, we could look at cases like Egypt, where you overthrow a dictatorship, but you sort of wind up with the military taking over again. Or we could look at Syria, which has devolved into, just endless conflict. Myanmar consistently comes across as being fundamentally different, whether it's because there is this roadmap towards democracy, whether it's because there is strong charismatic leadership, whether it's because there is such a degree of collaboration and cooperation against a communal enemy. In every interview, it seems that someone notes the seeming uniqueness of this conflict. And I'm wondering what, from your perspective, having seen it from the inside and also having examined and studied so many other conflicts, how do you see the Myanmar conflict as compared to other popular uprisings against dictatorial regimes that we've seen in modern history?
There's so many things to mention. I think I'll try to limit it to three that just came into my mind.
Hmm.
I would say, first of all, if you compare it, for example, to countries where there were some limited attempts to transform a popular uprising into more of an armed rebellion, sustainable armed rebellion, where it failed. There are examples in Venezuela, in Belarus, and in Iran. It never worked out because the regime still had a full monopoly on power, on the weapons, on the territory. And in Myanmar, there was already the existence of the ethnic armed organizations. One could argue that had these organizations like the KNU, the KIA, what else? The CNA, Karenni Army, had those organizations not already existed, there would have been no refuge for the many students, the many protesters to head to. There would have been no one to arm this new rebellion, to train all these new recruits, and it's just very likely that a anti regime resistance movement would have been much less successful, would have been much smaller, would have eventually fizzled out, as previous resistance movements had done. In the 80s, the Communist Party of Burma and such. So I think definitely already that the new wave of resistance fighters had this sort of older generation of ethnic armed organizations to call upon and to rely on for support was already a very distinguishing factor in the early developing stage of the rebellion. Another factor I would say was really distinguishing and a strength of the Myanmar resistance of the Spring Revolution is the matter of patience. Um, we've been at it for 3 years, and still there has been no rush towards Mandalay or Naypyidaw or Maniwa or any kind of rushed, costly offensives. When you look, for example, at Syria, which was another very successful rebellion in the early stage, you did see that they switched from guerrilla tactics to conventional war and to like taking entire swaths of territory after already like a year, 14 months of resistance, which in the end turned out to be too premature because the regime recovered, managed to fight back, managed to inflict devastating losses on the rebellion with its air force, its artillery, its tank units. Um, and in Myanmar, they've still been very patient. It took them 2.5 years before some groups would even start Operation 1027. And still, in large part of the countries, the conflict is mostly fought in a guerrilla style manner, in the better part of the Makwe region, in Tenanteri, in parts of Sagaing. Because still, in those regions, the resistance sense that they don't have the upper hand in a conventional fight, and they are patient enough to wait it out for another year or so before they really go on to like cleaning entire territories, like pushing the regime out in large areas. So that's also definitely a contributing factor to the success of the resistance. And I think a third, and this is also a factor which is often talked about, is that in Myanmar, contrary to other countries like Syria, which is a very prominent example, or like Belarus, there's really an absence of international involvement. The regime has its allies, sure, it has Russia and to some degree maybe Iran, China, and North Korea. But those are only sort of political or symbolic allies. There's no Russian bombing campaign in Myanmar like there was in Syria. There's no Chinese intervention on behalf of the Burmese regime like there was, like could have been feasible in other instances. So the Myanmar regime is really all alone, and it really has no one to call upon, to rely upon. And this is also to the benefit of the resistance, because in the long run, the resistance does have the upper hand. They have the popular support. They have the motivation. They have the upper hand in the number of fighters. Um, so they can stick it out. And the only benefit that the regime has for the moment is their money flows, their weaponry, and their territory. But as that continues to lessen as the resistance bit by bit chips away at either of those. So as long as there's no regional power or superpower doing the regime's bidding, um, they are at a major disadvantage. And this has been a distinguishing factor for the conflict in Myanmar, that there's really this absence of international involvement.
Mm. Which is kind of interesting because we lament the lack of international involvement. We lament the fact that the Western countries, whether it's the US or the EU or the United Nations in general, are not taking firm action, and even that ASEAN is not taking firm action on Myanmar. But the flip side of the coin then is that also Russia, China, and as you say to a lesser extent places like Iran, places like North Korea, are also not taking a very strong stance. Um, is a pretty crucial factor. So I'm wondering, would you agree? And I know this is a very big conjecture, but would you say that if a country is isolated, left in a vacuum, without external powers pushing and prodding their own interests, would you say that a revolutionary movement is more likely to succeed or less likely to succeed?
I think, in that sense, we really can see how the times have changed. 10 years ago, or longer ago, revolutionary movements or rebellions uh, oftentimes could only succeed with some international support, and that was, of course, in the unipolar world where we lived before. The US, uh, we just have to remember the example of Libya, where the people rose up against Gaddafi. They launched an armed rebellion. They were on the verge of losing their armed rebellion, and then there was a NATO fly zone, and the West intervened and basically served as the rebels' air force until they took the capital and they killed Gaddafi. But with Syria, then the situation already changed, and the West supported the rebellion, at least on the political front, and also they supplied some arms. They wouldn't go as far as the no-fly zone, but the West's political and geopolitical support for the rebellion, I think, really provoked the Russian counter-response. And the reality was that a regime like Russia was willing to go much further in supporting its side than the West was in supporting the rebellion. And just like you and everyone else, I'm just as frustrated about the lack of debate about Myanmar, the lack of awareness about Myanmar, the lack of action on the behalf of Western governments for Myanmar, especially when you can compare it to countries like Ukraine. But another part of me then can't help but think, maybe this is also for the best, at least looking at how the situation, the current trajectory in Myanmar is already going. I can imagine that, imagine a world where Myanmar would get supported, just like Ukraine would. That, we do have already the Burma Act passed in US Congress, but that would actually be followed by a different act which would allow for weapon transfers and for substantial support to different resistance groups. Don't you think it would be likely that if the Chinese would see a Western plot or like a Western backed regime change effort in Myanmar, that as much as they distrust and dislike the Burmese regime, that they would still, in their zero-sum geopolitical calculation, think, well, if the West is going to turn Myanmar into a pro-Western democracy on our borders, then we have no choice but to support the junta, to make sure that Myanmar stays an authoritarian country within our sphere of influence. And in that case, China being bordered on Myanmar and being willing to go much further and cross much more moral boundaries, red lines, in order to achieve its goal, would be able to support the Myanmar regime in a way which the West could never do with the resistance. And, I think the biggest threat, which it still is the biggest threat to the Spring Revolution and to its chance of succeeding, is not the regime itself or what the regime could do. It's really what the regional powers, India, China, and Thailand, could be doing. And the fact that they've mostly been sleeping on the situation in Myanmar has been to the benefit of the resistance and its freedom to continue its struggle. And a sort of dark scenario that which I still consider to be a very likely outcome. And I don't hope it will be the outcome, but I think it will be a likely outcome. Is that and we could already see that a bit with the capture of Myanmar, that as the resistance continues to advance, they continue to take more territory, that suddenly these countries will sort of wake up to the spirit of the situation. India, China, Thailand, maybe Bangladesh. Um, you know, they will probably do make the calculation that the Myanmar regime is beyond help, that it can't be supported militarily, but they could maybe really force all the different like the NUG, the resistance groups, or if that doesn't work, through a divide and conquer tactics, the ethnic armed organizations, to force them into a sort of shaky peace agreement with the military, where nominal governance, nominal civil control will be given back to the people, where we can, but where the military will be allowed to remain intact, will be spared a total collapse, a total destruction, will be allowed to serve as the armed force of the country. And that would basically then, bring us back to the status quo, which was maintained in Myanmar for a decade, and we all know how that ended. So that then basically a status quo will be restored, which could only set the ground for the next military coup in a decade or so.
Mm. Absolutely. So I mean, it's kind of an interesting point, but I think you raise a very good point. You make a very strong argument that strong Western influence to establish a pro-Western democracy, literally on China's doorstep, uh, could backfire in a way that, pragmatically speaking, Western forces would not be willing to double down on, would not be willing to continue to push on, and it could lead to a much worse situation. But let's let's move down back to the situation in Karenni itself, uh, because you spoke about the military not learning and the military still using the same tactics and setting up all these bases and using their artillery and using airstrikes and effectively terrorism tactics is, I think, how we can describe what the military's basic operations are. Um, how's that working for the military in Karenni right now? What does it, when we say that Karenni is not liberated, when we say that Loiko is still under military control, when we say that there are still active junta bases in Karenni, what does that actually functionally look like?
Um, well, if you look at it from a military point of view, you could say that the junta is really on its last legs in Karenni. They maintain a presence in the largest towns. Um, they control parts of Loika. They have a couple hilltop camps remaining, but they're all basically isolated, surrounded. They have no freedom of movement. They can't govern. All the areas and all the people of Karenni are basically governed by themselves. So it's only a symbolic military presence that the military has in these towns, to say that they're present there. Um, and the military would have been completely expelled from the region long ago had it not been for the fact that, especially in Karenni, the resistance itself is very limited in its arms, in its supplies. When it comes to manpower, the resistance outnumbers the forces of the military easily, but they
Mm,
simply do not have the weapons and ammunition to launch these decisive assaults. At least not without suffering unnecessary losses themselves, and I don't want to suffer unnecessary losses themselves. So in that sense, in Karenni, there's a bit of a frozen situation right now. Has been, I think, for a past month or two or so, where the regime forces are just dug into their bases, um, from where a couple times they would just shoot randomly around them, not even just with a military objective, but just to sort of communicate to the resistance, like, we're here,
mm,
keep your distance. And the resistance is not, in a lot of places, actively trying to smoke them out. The resistance just enjoys their freedom of movement. They can go around, they have their towns, and until they have the actual means to take a regime base, they're not going to try it. They're just going
mm,
to let soldiers stay where they are, and they'll just stay where they are. And as I said before, the current trajectory is beneficial to the resistance. Um, they are in a better position, at least in Karenni, in the long run. So um, I think it's not the worst idea for them to just wait it out now, at least with the monsoon seasons coming, and to try to deliver a decisive victory in Karenni in the next dry season, so starting October and onwards.
mm. But so, are you basically saying that the military are besieged, in essence, that they're stuck in their little bases and they, they can't project power from the base, they can't sortie out from the base, or is there still that risk that they might get in a truck, drive out of the base, machine gun some village, and then drive back to the base? Like how dangerous is it in proximity to these locations?
In some places, they have tried to sort of get out of their base and not to like launch a random raid on a village around them, but to sort of transfer troops from one base to the next one further down the road. But oftentimes these reinforcements have been completely wiped out, taken out by the resistance. There was just, I think, 1 or 2 weeks ago, reports that a regime column of around 100 soldiers had been completely neutralized by the resistance as it was making its way um, from Baulake to Pasang. The resistance had completely taken it out. They had like killed, on the top of my head, but I could be wrong about the exact numbers, killed 40 soldiers, taken another 60 prisoner. So that really shows how the resistance does dominate all the territory outside of these bases. So um, when the regime leaves their bases, they are almost assured to be ambushed, and they don't have that many men to spare to go on such raids. So it's also in that looking at their current situation, their best option to just sit in their base and to try to stick it out or survive for as long as possible.
Mm, that's really interesting. And so then, like in that context, it makes sense if they are not able to secure sort of regular supplies, food, medicine, ammunition, things of that nature, then eventually, one presumes they would have to leave those bases. Um, and with the rainy season coming, uh, one would assume that it's going to make it even more difficult for them to get resupply under those conditions. We can only hope.
Yeah,
But
from
then,
what I understand, the bases
yeah,
are mostly supplied by helicopters.
okay.
Um, so that the regime is still able to fly helicopters into Karenni and to fly over the bases. But that's
Mm,
still risky, some of the PDF members showed me videos that they had been recording through the scopes of their rifles, where they had been really watching the helicopters up close and oftentimes also shooting at the helicopters. And in order to have because the bases are small, it's just one hilltop, one compound, and in order for the regime to drop their supplies into the base and not, you know, misdrop them into resistance territory where they can be used by the PDF groups themselves, the helicopters do have to fly really low, at least over the base, and that of course then invites a lot of resistance attacks. So even though they're still able to launch those to conduct those supply raids, um, it will definitely be harder as well with the monsoon season because it will be very tricky to fly in the raining weather. And we've now already seen in Koran some rocket launchers, and
mm.
it could be a matter of time before the Karenni resistance forces get their hands on some of those as well, and that could then be a definite cutoff of those bases from any kind of supply opportunities.
Ironically, the military would experience a four cut strategy themselves, but it just raises an interesting point. This is not necessarily directly related to our conversation, but it's a point that I've had in discussions with many other people when we discuss lethal aid, and there's something to be said for rocket launchers, in that they sound very terrifying. They sound very serious, and there's a big explosion, and it's very scary, and everyone feels very hesitant when we talk about, oh, do we really want to sell rocket launchers or supply rocket launchers to a conflict? But when you think about it, rocket launchers can kind of only be used on legitimate military targets. You're not going to hear a story 10 years from now of somebody stealing from a corner shop with a rocket launcher. It's not applicable for that. The rocket launchers are
No,
something that stop
I can't
helicopters and
remember.
tanks.
I can't remember any incidents like that hearing anywhere in the news. Of like, just a civilian airplane or just a normal helicopter or something being shot out of
Mm.
the sky, but there's some guy getting his hand on the rocket launcher. It's really unheard of.
It's not. It's yeah, and like these rocket launchers, like they cost like $150,000 a piece. It's not something that you would be cavalier with, like, oh, I can just get another one. Like, no, you can't.
Yeah.
But if you can spend $150,000 to shoot down, uh, let's say a 34 $35 million helicopter, well, then you do that because that's
Yeah,
good value for money.
and in Syria they did have a program sort of for that. It was not necessarily with with like Stinger missiles for like helicopters,
Mm,
but eventually the CIA had this program where they would supply um, TOW anti-tank missiles
mm,
to the rebels, and these are like huge things. It's like a big pipe
yeah,
on like this tripod, and it's not something you can just carry on your shoulder. It really has to be set up.
yeah.
Um, and the way they did it, and also how they managed to keep their their oversight on it, is that the rebels were very clearly instructed. Like, you get this rocket launcher. We'll give you these six. I'm just speaking like, for example, figuratively, like these six missiles. Each missile has its own ID code. It's its own identification number, and we want you to record every missile before you fire it, to sort of record the identification number on the missile, then to film yourself firing it, and then to film the targets that you hit. And because because these missiles are super effective, they're like they're ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, so
Mm.
they can really lock on their targets and almost always hit it. The rebels only needed to be supplied with a fairly low amount, and it was very easy to then monitor how every rocket was being used
Mm.
in that sense.
Absolutely, because again, it's not like a machine gun where 90% of more than 90% of the bullets that are fired do not intend even to hit a
Yeah,
target. It could be just suppressing fire, it could just be hopeful fire. But with something like a tow missile launcher, as you say, or whether it's a Stinger missile, or whether it's an AT-4, whatever the case may be, you are definitely targeting something, and you know what you are targeting, and you know that it's a legitimate military target. So the civilian risk, the collateral risk is actually much lower, I would argue, when it comes to giving people access to this type of weaponry, than it would be if we were talking about machine guns and bullets. But for some reason, the public and the political establishment both seem to feel naturally more comfortable with the idea of supplying small arms to conflict zones than with the idea of supplying something like a rocket launcher. And I don't know. I just think this is very misplaced thinking.
yeah, definitely. Like, you could say with certainty that the bullets from a AK-47 have killed millions more people than the missile from a Stinger, from
Mm,
an ATGM or something. But still,
yeah,
those weapons are considered the less dangerous ones.
yeah. It's a very strange world we live in. Um, but turning to the other side of Karenni, then, right? So we say, okay, they've got these bases, they're in the bases, everybody knows how far you can be from the base to be safe, and the military doesn't really get to leave the bases very often. Now, does that mean that in the rest of Karenni state, there is opportunity to pursue economic activities, agricultural activities, natural exploitation activities? Are there opportunities in Karenni for people to do things that generate, vital resources, that generate wealth, and that generally allow people to access the things that they need to access? Or is there kind of a stagnation on all of these fronts?
Well, up to a certain extent, in the sense, and we also noticed when we tried to enter Karenni, the warplanes still operate over the entire territory.
Mm,
Um, Villages can still be bombed at a given moment. Um, from their hilltop bases, the regime's artillery can still have a bit of a further range. But even if that wasn't there, that would provide, of course, more. economic opportunity, but Karenni can't exist as an island on its own. It also needs to be able to trade its goods and its services with, you know, either the territories of Myanmar around it, or with Thailand. And areas around it are still either controlled by the regime, active frontline areas like in Pekon, for example, or down in Karen State. And Thailand is really keeping it a tight lid on things. That some very limited supplies are let through, but it's not enough to actually sustain a local economy in Karenni
Mm.
itself. Um, so in order for, I think Karenni will first have to be liberated from a military point of view, and only after that, as the resistance territory also expands outside of the state borders of Karenni, can a sustainable economical situation be created.
Mm. Good to know. Good to know. So, because it's just so strange, because we've seen these videos lately coming out on YouTube of foreigners who often don't understand anything about the Myanmar context. They're just, various flavors of travel vloggers and YouTube backpackers and things of them, like traveling into Yangon, traveling into Mandalay, and possibly even Naypyidaw. And whether they're aware of the situation, whether they have just a very vague concept. What's interesting to me is that in these large cities that are still largely military controlled, there is substantial economic activity. There are people going to cafes, tea houses, uh, all these sorts of things. Like, life seems to be continuing in these places, albeit under the sort of auspices of a military dictatorship. But life and economic activity continue nonetheless. But it seems that in these places that are fighting so hard for their freedom, they don't have even the basic luxury of being able to go to the tea house or going to a corner store and finding food that they could buy, or finding a way to try and make a living, finding some sort of economic opportunity. It seems that the situation there is much more, um, for lack of a better term, just survival oriented than anything higher order than that. Do you think that this is likely to change anytime? Do you see signs that maybe there is a bit of progress, that things are not as dire as they might have been previously, or is it likely to stay this way until the state is entirely liberated?
I think that's very hard to say. No, I don't.
Mm.
I don't think we should be fooled in thinking that because there's a lot of economic opportunity in major cities, that means that life is just normal there. That or that the people even uh, would not be opposed to the military either, like the people in
Mm.
the peripheral regions are. Um, but I think it's also very important for the regime to maintain a bit of that sense of normality, and that's why they're always so happy with these YouTubers flying into
Yes.
Myanmar and like making their video about this exotic place where everything is so
Mm.
beautiful and stuff. And it also then makes it more immoral of these YouTubers to actually go there and to sort of do a regime's bidding to spread their narrative, just
Yeah.
for their own visibility online, like for their own view
Mm.
counts and stuff. And that's something that we also saw really with Syria. It's like these uh, YouTubers were often completely clueless about the
Mm.
actual cause of the conflict, about the country itself, but they hear like, "Ooh, it's a dangerous place. There's a war going on." And like the most important thing, very few people come here, so then they think,
Yes.
I'll be the unique adventurous one by going, and then they go to Myanmar, and that they take their exotic shots on like the 16-lane highway in Naypyidaw, and
Mm.
they mesmerize at being like this beautiful 5-star hotel and being the only guest here. And then the thing you always hear, especially when not even when they respond to criticism, but when they're trying to sort of be ahead of the criticism, is they say, well, like, well, the media is always so negative about this country, and of course there's a war and there's fighting. But I want to focus on the positive sides because there's also so much positive things to say about the country. As if we and the coverage that we do, that we all do it not because we want to
Mm,
spread awareness about Myanmar, but because we just want to be negative about the country all the time. We just want to be constantly like stressing how bad of a place it is because it was some sort of
mm,
spite with Myanmar, and that actually they're the ones who appreciate the place and want to do it as a big service by focusing on positive stories and showing the beauty of it all, which in a sense it's just complete clueless, and they're just there for their own interest and to while doing it are spreading the narrative or regime because that's basically the one that has opened the door for them to them. That's sort of the quid pro quo that then takes place, an unspoken quid pro quo,
mm.
where they're allowed access into a country, get to film all these exotic, unique things, and have these big hotels to themselves, and then they project a sense of normality which is not there, which is shown to them, to which then in the end benefits the regime's narrative that they're managing the country quite well and everything is just relatively normal.
Exactly. I think it. I would very much like to reach out to some of these YouTubers and be able to speak to them and be able to sort of have a discussion about this because it ultimately comes down to propaganda that you are, whether you know it or not, you are pushing their propaganda. I would say it's a little bit better if you go to North Korea for the reason that no one or very few people watching that in the West are going to think, oh, North Korea must be such a wonderful, lovely place. I should plan my next vacation there. Everybody understands that what you're saying has been very heavily filtered, it has been very heavily controlled, and that you need to spread a certain level of propaganda in order to make it out of the country safely. But when it comes to Myanmar, people don't know this, and an undercurrent I've seen in a few videos is almost conspiratorial. You say, oh, the media always paint it negatively, but sometimes it gets a little bit darker than that. It starts to go into territory of, oh, the media wants to say this country is poor and oppressed and unsafe, but that's because the media are all part of the whatever the enemy this week is, and they're all spreading the lies and they're all trying to scare you and terrify you, and military dictatorships are wonderful, beautiful places, and we should all be so lucky to live under them. And it sort of reminds me of Tucker Carlson's trip to Russia that took place not too long ago, where he was just going on about how wonderful his experiences in Russia, and everyone in America is so critical of Russia and the Russian government and the Russian regime at a time when Russia has invaded a foreign state. It's I would say it's insidious, but in the case of these YouTubers, it's
100
mostly
agree.
just ignorant. Um,
Yeah,
but
it's but how long can you just sort of shelter them with saying it's just ignorance? Because like at some point it also has to be willful ignorance, especially when it's like these YouTubers who sort of when they're really like these travel YouTubers or they're really taking it on themselves, for example, to visit every country in the world. You would
yeah,
think that like once you have visited enough places, like once you have been to 50 or 60 countries, that should have taught you something about the world. That should at least giving you some sense of sensitivity and about some sense of, you know, that not everything is sort of some uh, touristic playground where you can just, live your best life. But there's also places where people are really struggling, where
yeah.
the government is not operating in a moral manner, and to
Mm.
then still be sort of um, used as to spread a certain narrative, and in exchange be allowed to shoot your video there. I feel at some point it's also just really a willful ignorance that you're signing up to.
Absolutely. And I think this is sort of where I want to sort of finish our discussion here on the much bigger picture, the global picture. And that is the media landscape and the information war. Because, we can talk about these YouTubers and we can say, well, they're not doing the right thing. but they are posting videos, and those videos are getting views. And it doesn't seem that Western established media houses are as keen to do the same thing, to invest in getting people to go to the country, film content, talk to people. Because one thing that these YouTubers do demonstrate is that there is a possibility to get into the country, either into the military controlled areas or, as is your case, into the liberated areas. But you can get into the military controlled area. You can talk to people. You can film footage. You would have to do it very carefully and ethically, because those people can disappear as a result of things that they say on camera, and we saw that when Clarissa Waters visited Yangon.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
a professional journalist, I believe, should know how to navigate these things ethically. The possibility exists to bring this message to the outside world in a way that is ethical and also informative, but it doesn't seem to be happening for some reason. When it's on YouTube and the title is something like I visited a war zone, or no one ever travels to this country, or I was the only white person, da da da, whatever, people click on that. It's clickbait, it's interesting, and
Yeah.
you watch it, and it's a
Yeah.
10-minute video of which 5 minutes are spent either in the airport or in the hotel. um,
Mm-hmm.
but then if you go to a media house and you say, I want to put together a 20, 30-minute documentary or a 1 hour documentary on what's actually happening in this country and how people are trying to survive under a military dictatorship, it seems that a lot of media houses are like, well, yeah, sure, maybe when Israel's not so interesting, maybe when Ukraine's not so interesting, maybe when no one's as
Yeah.
concerned about China, Taiwan. What can we be doing, do you think, in the more professional journalistic media landscape to try to drive interest and to try to create content that is going to inform audiences ethically?
I think what we should be doing is what's already being done. Just keep spreading the awareness, and just bring the conflict in Myanmar and the millions of stories of the Burmese people to cover those stories and to bring them close to the audience to the Western audience at home. And it's a very difficult situation now for Myanmar, because you're right, it's a bit of it's sadly has to compete for airtime and for coverage with Ukraine and Gaza, and that's not a fault of those conflicts. I'm very happy with any coverage that the people of Ukraine, people of Gaza can get. I think it's really a fault on just the general media logic that we have in the West, where we think like, okay, we have our news broadcast, we want to have a political item, a foreign conflict item, and a multimedia item or something, where it's really sort of this thematically structured, and there's only in any broadcast or any paper room for one conflict, one country. Even if there's news to cover in more,
Mm,
and I think uh, if there would be more substantial Western coverage from like correspondents heading into Myanmar very regularly, that would already go a long way, because it would increase the awareness of the conflict among the Western audience. It would familiarize people with what's going on there, with the people there, with the struggle, what they're going through. But to also then uh, speak on behalf of the press a little bit. I do know that there are many journalists, especially the Western correspondents in Southeast Asia, like in Thailand and stuff, who are very eager to go to Myanmar, who really want to get across the border and cover the conflict. Like, for example, a friend of mine works for a Dutch TV network. He's a Southeast Asia correspondent, and he lives in Thailand. But because he lives in Thailand, he's basically prevented from covering the conflict from Myanmar, because Thailand officially still has closed its borders with the resistance territories, and
mm,
he lives in Thailand. He has his home there. He lives there with his girlfriend. She goes to university there. If he sneaks across the border to Myanmar, as I did, and he will be on the 8 o'clock newscast reporting from Loika or something, and Thai authorities would find out about it, then he would be expelled from the country.
mm.
and he could not continue his job as a Southeast Asia correspondent, being responsible to cover all those different countries. So it's also definitely a limiting factor that the countries bordering Myanmar are really not sympathetic towards the resistance and have really keeping a closed door policy on foreigners entering these territories. And that was very different from, for example, the situation in Syria, where Turkey was largely sympathetic towards the rebels and allowed the foreign press to cross the border into rebel territories as they pleased.
Mm. I mean, it's certainly not being made easy, as you say. Particularly, it seems on the Thai side, but we've spoken to Indian analysts, on and off the record, and the news from the western side, as in western border of Myanmar, also doesn't seem to be particularly good. There's a lot of political pressure to stay quiet. I am confident that the Chinese state would also have their own official position on the Myanmar crisis, and they would not particularly enjoy people challenging that official position if they were sneaking across the border into Kachin state and reporting and coming back. So certainly it is very, very difficult. I understand that, but it's it's sort of gratifying to know that at the very least we are, in terms of ethical and effective reporting, as you say, the work is being done. It needs to continue being done, and that, I think that's a pretty important point to make. I know it's a thing that I've referenced in other interviews in the past, but it stays with me. The Jon Stewart comment recently saying that the job of changing the world is a lunch pail job. It's a boring day in, day out, 9 to 5, repetitive slog.
Yeah,
It's not sexy and exciting. It's not like an action hero movie, but it has to be done if you want to
yeah,
make improvements in the world. And
exactly.
I think it's
It's it's not really a appreciative job or a well paid job
no,
either, and you really have to get your job satisfaction out of the idea that you are doing it for a greater purpose.
absolutely. Um, so anyway, I really appreciate your time and I really appreciate your insights. I think having these opportunities to talk to media and to talk to people who've been there, it's definitely exciting for me. Um, it can be a little bit emotionally frustrating as well, because I sort of, part of me wishes that I could also have been there and could also have seen it, but being able at least vicariously to get a glimpse of what is real and happening in the country is, I think, absolutely essential, to me and to our audience. So we really appreciate the work that you've done and the insights that you've given. But before we finish, you may or may not be aware, by tradition, we always end our episodes by inviting our guests to share some final thoughts on anything. It could be directly related to what we've spoken about today. It could be much more broad, but anything that you think that the audience would benefit from knowing about, thinking about, considering as they go about their day. I would invite you to just share anything you have on your mind now.
Thank you. Well, let me first of all thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation because with the little knowledge that there is in general about Myanmar, oftentimes when I go on like a podcast or show to talk about situation, I need like half of my time to even just introduce the conflict to explain to people what it's all about before I can even get to what I want to talk about. And I really enjoyed where that we could just jump straight into the details here and just have a very thorough discussion about underlying currents and everything. And I really appreciate that you guys put such great effort into consistently reporting on Myanmar, to really having this next level discussions about it, which you really don't see in any established media. So that really makes you guys unique, and I really want to thank you for that in the first place. Um, and yeah, I think um, as like a closing statement, I think that what Myanmar shows us, or the people of Myanmar shows us, is that we have no right to be cynical about the state of the world, about our own lives, about just general events in the world, because people, and not just news consumers, but also diplomats, analysts, seasoned journalists, always have a tendency of being as negative as possible about world events. They always say, Ukraine, like in the beginning of the invasion, they said Ukraine will probably lose the war in a few days or so. They said, things like they're saying things like, "Oh, Donald Trump is probably going to win the election. This revolution will fail. That uprising will fail. This dictator will stay in power." And I think they said all the same things about Myanmar, where after the coup they said, well, there's going to be protests, but the military is going to crack down and it's going to go back to normal. And so far, the Burmese people have really proven the cynics wrong. And they really show us that, it's okay, and it's sometimes even the better option to be optimistic and to be hopeful about events that you're seeing, instead of being a cynic, so that you'll be as negative as possible with the prospect of being able to say, "I told you so" in a few years or so.
One of the most tragic aspects of the current crisis in Myanmar is how isolated Burmese protesters feel, and in fact are. Thankfully, through our nonprofit organization Better Burma, we are able to ensure that all donations successfully reach their intended target. So if you found yourself moved by today's discussion and want to do what you can to help, please consider giving to our fund, which is 100% directed towards supporting the movement. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Hoba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranamano